What surprised me most over the years was not how complicated money became, but how quietly the most important lessons announced themselves. There were no warnings, no dramatic signals, no clear instructions handed out at the beginning. The rules that mattered most operated in the background, almost invisibly, shaping outcomes while people focused on louder, more obvious things. By the time many recognized those rules, the consequences had already arrived. Loss had done the teaching that patience could have prevented. I watched people work hard, earn steadily, and still end up financially fragile. They believed effort alone would carry them forward. When problems appeared, they assumed more income would fix everything. Sometimes it helped temporarily, but it never addressed the underlying behavior. Money amplified habits rather than correcting them. Those who were disciplined grew stronger quietly. Those who were careless simply scaled their mistakes. That realization took years to fully sink in, and I learned it by watching outcomes, not listening to explanations. What made these rules so easy to miss was that they didn't demand attention early. Nothing dramatic happened when they were ignored. Spending a little more felt harmless. Borrowing felt manageable. Reacting emotionally felt justified. Progress still seemed possible. The damage accumulated slowly, beneath the surface, until one day flexibility was gone and options narrowed. People were shocked by how trapped they felt, not realizing they had been walking toward that trap for decades without noticing. I also noticed that formal education rarely touched these ideas. Schools taught formulas, not temperament. They taught calculation, not restraint. They rewarded intelligence and speed, not patience and survival. As a result, people entered financial life believing the hardest part was learning what to do. In reality, the hardest part was learning what not to do, and that lesson rarely arrived in time. The quiet rules were ignored because they did not feel urgent. Another reason these rules were learned late is that they lacked glamour. Avoiding debt does not feel heroic. Saving steadily does not create stories. Saying no to temptation does not attract praise. Meanwhile, bold moves, rapid success, and visible wins capture attention even when they carry hidden risks. People naturally gravitated toward what felt exciting and underestimated what kept them safe. The quiet rules worked slowly and without applause, which made them easy to dismiss. Over time, I learned to recognize the patterns that preceded trouble. Urgency was one. Overconfidence was another. A belief that rules were flexible just this once almost always came before regret. The people who avoided these traps were rarely the smartest in the room. They were the most restrained. They treated money as something to be protected first and grown second. That priority order made all the difference. Looking back, the tragedy was not ignorance. It was delay. The rules were always there, quietly operating, quietly compounding, quietly punishing neglect, and rewarding discipline. People didn't fail because they couldn't learn them. They failed because they learned them after the cost was already paid. Understanding that changed how I viewed money entirely, and it is why I believe the quiet rules matter more than any loud advice you will ever hear. One of the earliest quiet rules people missed was confusing income with wealth. I saw this mistake everywhere. People believed that earning more would eventually solve every financial problem. When money felt tight, the solution seemed obvious. Work harder, get promoted, find a better paying opportunity. Income became the focus, while behavior stayed unchanged. What followed was predictable. Expenses rose with income, commitments multiplied, and flexibility quietly disappeared. Years later, many were earning far more than before, but felt just as trapped. What people failed to notice was that income is noisy and visible, while wealth is silent and structural. Income arrives regularly and creates the illusion of progress. Wealth grows quietly in the background, often without drawing attention to itself. You can have a high income and no resilience, or a modest income and tremendous stability. I watch people with impressive salaries live in constant financial anxiety, while others with far less income slept well because their obligations were light and their margins were wide. The difference had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with restraint. Another misunderstanding followed naturally from this one. Activity was mistaken for progress. People stayed busy with money. They adjusted, reacted, optimized, and rearranged. They talked constantly about finances, markets, and plans. Being involved felt responsible. Stillness felt lazy. But when I looked at long-term outcomes, the busy ones often made little headway. Their effort was real, but it was misdirected. Progress is not measured by motion. It is measured by whether your position becomes stronger and more durable over time. This confusion was reinforced by the world around them. Employers rewarded visible effort. Society admired hustle. Financial media celebrated constant action. Very little attention was given to quiet accumulation or risk avoidance. People learned to equate movement with competence because that is what received recognition. The quiet rule that fewer, better decisions outperform constant adjustment was drowned out by noise. What made this especially costly was how it delayed learning. As long as income kept rising and activity stayed high, the underlying fragility remained hidden. There was no immediate feedback to suggest something was wrong. Only when income stalled, markets turned, or life intervened did the weakness reveal itself. By then, choices were limited. The lesson arrived late, delivered by stress instead of foresight. Over time, I came to see that wealth is built by what you keep, not what you earn. Progress comes from strengthening your position, not from constantly rearranging it. Those who learned this early gained an enormous advantage. Those who learned it late often spent the rest of their lives trying to recover ground that never needed to be lost. Looking back, this rule was always present, quietly shaping outcomes. Income made noise. Activity created distraction. Wealth grew silent or failed depending on whether people understood the difference. Those who never learned it stayed busy forever. Those who did stopped confusing motion with progress and finally began moving forward in a way that lasted. Another rule that revealed itself only after years of observation was the absolute importance of avoiding ruin. People spoke endlessly about growth, returns, and opportunity, yet very few spent time thinking about survival. They assumed that as long as they were intelligent and hardworking, recovery would always be possible. That assumption was wrong. I watched lives altered permanently by a single financial error that could not be undone. Once flexibility is lost, the future narrows quickly, and no amount of intelligence can reopen doors that have already closed. What made this rule so quiet was that ruin rarely announces itself in advance. It often begins with decisions that look reasonable in isolation. A little more risk here, a little more leverage there. A willingness to stretch because things have been going well. Nothing breaks immediately. In fact, early success often reinforces the behavior. People interpret survival as validation. They mistake luck for skill and stability for permanence. By the time reality intervenes, the structure is already fragile. I learned to think of financial life as a system that must remain intact above all else. Growth is optional. Survival is not. A system that collapses even once cannot benefit from future opportunities. People who ignore this tend to focus on maximizing outcomes instead of protecting against unacceptable ones. They ask how much they can gain instead of how much they can afford to lose without changing their lives. That inversion leads to very different behavior. The asymmetry between loss and gain is what makes this rule so important. Losing half of what you have does not put you halfway back. It puts you much further behind. Recovery demands higher risk, more time, and greater emotional strain. Many people never fully recover, not because they are incapable, but because the damage forces them into defensive positions that limit future choices. Avoiding ruin preserves optionality, and optionality is one of the most valuable assets anyone can have. What struck me most was how often people dismissed the possibility of severe loss as unlikely or pessimistic. They preferred optimistic forecasts and reassuring narratives. Yet history is full of examples where unlikely events happened with devastating consequences. Planning only for the average outcome is a mistake. The average outcome does not matter if the extreme one destroys you. The quiet rule is to prepare for what you cannot afford to have happen, not just for what you hope will happen. Over time, I became far more interested in identifying behaviors that could permanently impair a financial life. Excessive debt, concentrated bets without margin of safety. Emotional decision-making under pressure. These were not complex ideas. They were simple, almost obvious. But they were easy to ignore because avoiding them did not feel ambitious. It felt cautious. And caution is rarely celebrated. Looking back, I realized that the people who endured were not those who found the fastest path forward. They were those who avoided the paths that led to irreversible damage. They stayed solvent, they stayed flexible, they stayed calm. That allowed time to work in their favor. The quiet rule was always there. Survival first, growth second. Those who learned it early rarely talked about it. Those who learned it late often learned it the hard way. Time itself turned out to be another quiet rule that people consistently underestimated. They treated it as something abundant and forgiving, assuming they could always make up for mistakes later. I watched this belief quietly sabotage countless financial lives. Decisions were postponed, discipline was delayed, compounding was interrupted. Nothing seemed urgent because the future felt distant. By the time urgency arrived, time was no longer available in the way people had assumed it would be. What made this rule so deceptive was how slowly the consequences appeared. Ignoring time rarely caused immediate pain. Saving a little later did not feel dangerous. Taking a few years off from discipline did not feel permanent. People believed they could accelerate later, that effort and intelligence would compensate for lost years. But time does not negotiate. It compounds quietly for those who respect it and disappears just as quietly for those who don't. The bill always arrives, but it arrives decades after the decisions that caused it. I noticed that impatience often disguised itself as optimism. People told themselves they were enjoying life now and would get serious later. That story felt reasonable because nothing bad happened immediately. But what was lost was not money alone. What was lost was the multiplier. Years without compounding cannot be recovered with enthusiasm or cleverness. Starting late is not fatal, but starting early is extraordinarily powerful. This is one of those truths that sounds obvious only after it is too late to benefit fully from it. Another aspect people missed was how time magnifies behavior. Small, repeated actions mattered far more than occasional bursts of effort. Consistent saving, conservative decisions, and patient ownership grew quietly into something formidable. Inconsistent behavior, even when paired with high income or intelligence, produced fragile outcomes. People looked for dramatic turning points when the real turning points were habits repeated thousands of times without attention. What troubled me most was how often people traded long-term time for short-term comfort. They chose convenience over discipline, relief over restraint. Each choice seemed minor. Together they reshaped the future. By the time people realized they had boxed themselves in, time was no longer on their side. They were forced to take risks they would have avoided earlier, simply because they no longer had room to wait. I also learned that respecting time reduced stress dramatically. Those who built their lives around long horizons were calmer. They did not need to rush. They did not need to chase. They understood that progress was slow by nature and that slowness was not failure. That understanding insulated them from panic and from the pressure to act unnecessarily. Time became an ally rather than an enemy. Looking back, this rule was always operating, whether people acknowledged it or not. Time rewarded patience and punished delay with equal consistency. It did not care about intention or intelligence. It responded only to behavior repeated long enough to matter. Those who learned this early rarely felt clever. They simply felt secure. Those who learned it late often spent their remaining years trying to compress decades of discipline into a few stressful years. The quiet rule was never about speed. It was about direction and persistence. Once you fall behind time, catching up becomes exponentially harder. Respecting time early and consistently is not dramatic, but it is decisive. It is one of the simplest advantages available and one of the most frequently ignored until the cost becomes impossible to deny. Another quiet rule that revealed itself slowly was how lifestyle choices quietly shape financial destiny. I watched people make decisions that felt harmless in the moment and costly only years later. A slightly bigger house, a more expensive car, a few additional comforts justified by rising income. None of these choices looked reckless on their own. In fact, they often felt deserved. But together, they formed commitments that removed flexibility one decision at a time. What people rarely noticed was that lifestyle inflation does not announce itself as danger. It feels like progress. Each upgrade is framed as a reward for hard work or success. The problem is not the enjoyment itself. The problem is permanence. Fixed obligations do not adjust easily when circumstances change. Income can fluctuate, markets can turn, health can intervene. Expenses, once locked in, remain stubbornly fixed. That rigidity is where stress begins, and stress is where poor decisions thrive. I saw many people trapped not by lack of opportunity, but by lack of options. Their finances required everything to continue going well. Any disruption became a crisis rather than an inconvenience. Under that pressure, they took risks they would never have considered earlier. They chased returns to support commitments instead of letting returns serve them. Knowledge could explain what was happening, but discipline would have prevented the situation from forming in the first place. Another aspect that surprised me was how quietly freedom disappeared. People believed freedom came from earning more. In reality, it came from needing less. Those with modest lifestyles and wide margins slept better, made calmer decisions, and weathered setbacks with far less damage. Those with high incomes and high obligations lived closer to the edge than they realized. The difference had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with restraint exercised long before trouble arrived. What made this rule especially quiet was how socially reinforced excess became. Bigger looked better. More looked successful. Frugality looked outdated. Very few voices celebrated simplicity or moderation. Yet, when I observed outcomes over long periods, it was clear that simplicity protected people from their own worst impulses. It allowed them to wait, to say no, and to avoid decisions made under pressure. Over time, I learned that the real danger was not spending itself, but spending that assumed permanence. When people committed their future earnings before they arrived, they reduced their ability to adapt. Flexibility is a form of wealth that does not appear on balance sheets, but it determines how well someone survives change. Losing flexibility is often the first step toward making big mistakes later. Looking back, this rule was always working in the background. Those who learned it early rarely felt deprived. They felt secure. Those who learned it late often confused stress with bad luck, never realizing it was the quiet accumulation of choices made years earlier. Lifestyle discipline does not feel heroic, but it quietly preserves the one thing that makes every other rule possible: the ability to choose calmly when circumstances refuse to cooperate. Debt was another quiet rule that revealed its true nature only with time. Early on, it rarely looked dangerous. In fact, it often appeared helpful, even intelligent. Borrowing made things easier. It smoothed progress, accelerated plans, and allowed people to enjoy things sooner rather than later. I watched many believe that because debt solved short-term problems, it must be a permanent ally. What they failed to see was how quietly it changed the balance of power in their lives. Debt removes patience. When obligations exist, waiting becomes expensive. Every decision is now filtered through a schedule that cannot be ignored. Bills arrive on time regardless of conditions. Interest accumulates without regard for mood or circumstance. I saw people with good judgment forced into bad decisions simply because debt had eliminated their ability to pause. Knowledge told them what the right move was. Debt told them they didn't have the time to make it. What made debt especially deceptive was how manageable it seemed at first. Payments fit comfortably within income. Nothing felt strained. This early comfort created confidence, and confidence encouraged more borrowing. The system appeared stable as long as conditions remained favorable, but favorable conditions are never permanent. When income slowed, markets turned, or unexpected expenses appeared, debt transformed from convenience into constraint almost overnight. The shift was sudden, but the cause had been accumulating quietly for years. I also noticed how debt distorted risk-taking behavior. People who owed money felt pressure to generate higher returns. That pressure pushed them toward investments they would have avoided if they were unencumbered. Risk was no longer optional. It became necessary just to maintain equilibrium. This is how people slide from prudence into speculation without consciously choosing to do so. Debt narrowed choices until only uncomfortable ones remained. Another problem was psychological. Debt created background anxiety even when everything seemed fine. It occupied mental space and influenced decisions in subtle ways. People became more reactive, more sensitive to short-term outcomes, more willing to compromise long-term judgment for immediate relief. That emotional strain weakened discipline. The quiet rule was not that all debt is evil, but that debt always reduces freedom, and reduced freedom increases the likelihood of mistakes. Over time, I learned to view debt as something that must justify itself under the worst possible conditions, not the best. If a decision only works when nothing goes wrong, it is fragile. Debt magnifies fragility. Avoiding it whenever possible created resilience that did not show up in early results, but proved invaluable later. Those without debt could wait. They could say no. They could endure volatility without panic. Looking back, the people who learned this rule early were rarely the most aggressive. They accepted slower progress in exchange for control. They valued flexibility over acceleration. Those who learned it late often felt betrayed by something that once felt helpful, never realizing that the danger had always been there, quietly compounding alongside the benefits. Debt is not loud. It does not announce disaster. It simply shifts risk from the future into the present and demands payment regardless of outcome. Understanding that early changes everything. Understanding it late often changes very little, because by then the options are already gone. Emotions turned out to be one of the quietest and most expensive forces in financial life. They rarely announced themselves as problems. Fear felt like caution. Excitement felt like opportunity. Envy felt like motivation. Ego felt like confidence. Each emotion carried a reasonable story, and because the story sounded logical, people trusted it. What they didn't see was how consistently these feelings overrode judgment at the worst possible moments. I watched fear do its damage during downturns. Prices fell, uncertainty rose, and suddenly long-term plans felt unbearable. People knew, intellectually, that selling in panic was a mistake. They had read about it, they had warned others about it, yet when the discomfort became personal, knowledge dissolved. Fear demanded action, not correctness. Selling brought relief, even if it guaranteed regret later. The quiet rule was that emotional relief in the present is often purchased with permanent damage to the future. Excitement caused just as much harm, though it was harder to recognize. Rising markets, popular ideas, and stories of easy success created a sense of urgency. People felt foolish for not participating. Waiting felt like missing out. Excitement narrowed time horizons and loosened standards. Risk that would have seemed unacceptable in calm conditions suddenly felt reasonable. Knowledge was still present, but it was drowned out by the desire to be part of something happening now. Envy worked more slowly, but just as effectively. Watching others appear to move ahead distorted judgment. People stopped evaluating decisions on their own merits and began measuring them against someone else's results. That comparison pushed them into actions that did not fit their situation, temperament, or understanding. The quiet rule was that copying behavior without copying circumstances almost always leads to disappointment. Ego completed the cycle. Success bred confidence, and confidence quietly turned into overconfidence. People began to believe they were different, smarter, or more capable of managing risk. Rules that once felt sensible began to feel restrictive. Discipline weakened because it no longer felt necessary. This was often the moment when the largest mistakes were made, not during struggle, but during success. What made emotions so dangerous was not their presence, but their invisibility. People rarely said, "I am making this decision because I am afraid or excited." They said they were being prudent, proactive, or opportunistic. The story protected their self-image, while the behavior undermined their future. Avoiding big mistakes required learning to distrust emotional urgency, even when it sounded intelligent. Over time, I learned that calm behavior was one of the strongest advantages anyone could develop. Calm allowed knowledge to function. Calm allowed time to work. Calm reduced the number of decisions made under pressure. Those who cultivated emotional distance did not eliminate feelings, but they refused to let feelings drive actions. That refusal protected them in ways no analysis ever could. Looking back, emotional control was never about suppression. It was about recognition and delay. Feelings pass, consequences compound. The quiet rule was simple. Never make permanent decisions in temporary emotional states. Those who learned this early rarely felt heroic. They simply avoided the kinds of mistakes that feel justified in the moment and devastating in hindsight. Simplicity was another quiet rule that took people years to appreciate. Complexity felt intelligent. It gave the impression of control and sophistication. More accounts, more strategies, more adjustments, more moving parts of it created the sense that something productive was happening. Yet when I observed outcomes over long periods, complexity rarely protected anyone. It multiplied points of failure and increased the chances that emotion, error, or overconfidence would slip in unnoticed. I saw people build elaborate financial systems that depended on everything working smoothly. When conditions were favorable, those systems appeared impressive. When conditions changed, they became fragile. A single breakdown in one part forced reactions in another. Decisions had to be made quickly, often under stress. Knowledge was no longer helpful because there was too much to manage at once. Discipline collapsed under the weight of constant judgment calls. The quiet rule was that fewer moving parts create fewer opportunities for serious mistakes. Simplicity worked differently. It reduced decision frequency. It limited exposure. It made behavior more predictable and easier to maintain under pressure. People with simple structures rarely needed to act urgently. They were not constantly optimizing or reacting. Their systems were designed to tolerate boredom, uncertainty, and temporary discomfort. That tolerance mattered more than any clever adjustment ever could. Another benefit of simplicity was clarity. When things went wrong, it was easier to understand why. There were fewer variables to blame and fewer excuses to hide behind. This clarity allowed learning without panic. Complex systems, by contrast, encouraged denial. When outcomes disappointed, people blamed the wrong factors or added even more complexity in an attempt to fix what was broken. Each layer increased fragility rather than reducing it. I also noticed how simplicity strengthened discipline. Simple rules were easier to follow consistently. They did not require constant interpretation or negotiation. When temptation arrived, the answer was already known. Complex strategies required judgment at precisely the moments when judgment was weakest. The more often someone had to decide, the more likely they were to decide badly at least once. Avoiding big mistakes often meant designing systems that reduced the need for decisions altogether. What surprised many people was that simplicity did not mean stagnation. Progress still happened, but it happened quietly. Results accumulated slowly and steadily without drama. There were fewer stories to tell, fewer adjustments to brag about, and fewer moments of excitement. But there were also fewer regrets, fewer emergencies, and fewer irreversible errors. Looking back, I came to see simplicity as a form of respect for human limitations. It acknowledged that even intelligent people make mistakes, especially under stress. Instead of trying to outthink uncertainty, simplicity stepped around it. By limiting exposure and reducing complexity, people gave themselves a better chance of behaving sensibly when it mattered most. The quiet rule was never about doing less for its own sake. It was about doing only what was necessary and sustainable. Those who embraced simplicity did not feel deprived. They felt stable. And stability over long periods turned out to be one of the most powerful advantages anyone could have. Social pressure turned out to be one of the most underestimated forces shaping financial behavior. It worked quietly, without commands or rules, yet it pushed people toward decisions they would never have made on their own. I watched sensible plans abandoned simply because they looked unimpressive next to someone else's apparent success. Comparison crept in slowly, and once it took hold, judgment began to shift without anyone noticing. People rarely admitted they were influenced by others. They believed they were acting independently, making rational choices. In reality, they were reacting to what they saw around them. A friend appeared to be doing better. A colleague talked about a bold move. Someone online shared a success story. These signals created a subtle pressure to keep up, to not look slow or cautious. The quiet rule was that comparison shortens time horizons and increases risk, even when people insist it doesn't. What made social pressure so dangerous was how normal it felt. Wanting similar outcomes did not seem unreasonable, but circumstances are never identical. Risk tolerance differs, time horizons differ, obligations differ. Copying results without copying context led people into positions they were not equipped to handle. When things went wrong, they blamed bad luck, never realizing the real mistake was allowing someone else's path to dictate their own. I also noticed how social environments rewarded visible action. Talking about moves felt productive. Admitting patience felt awkward. People who stayed disciplined often said little, while those constantly adjusting had plenty to discuss. This created the illusion that activity equaled intelligence. Quiet progress rarely attracted attention, which made it harder to maintain when surrounded by louder voices. Discipline required accepting that good behavior would not always be socially reinforced. Another subtle effect was how social pressure eroded boundaries. Rules that once felt firm began to feel negotiable when others ignored them without immediate consequence. People told themselves they were being flexible or open-minded. In reality, they were drifting. Each comparison nudged them a little further from their own principles. Over time, the accumulation of small compromises led to decisions they would have rejected outright if presented all at once. What helped some resist this pressure was clarity about personal goals. Those who knew exactly what they were trying to protect were less tempted by what others were chasing. They measured progress against their own standards, not against external applause. That internal reference point acted as a shield. Without it, social comparison filled the gap and dictated behavior by default. Looking back, this rule was painfully obvious in hindsight. The loudest paths were rarely the safest. The most admired strategies were often the most fragile. Those who ignored the noise and focused on their own limits, timelines, and needs quietly moved ahead while others exhausted themselves trying to keep up. The quiet rule was never to isolate yourself completely, but to be selective about influence. Not every success story deserves attention. Not every path is meant to be followed. Learning to resist social pressure is not about stubbornness. It is about self-preservation. Those who mastered it avoided mistakes that felt socially acceptable in the moment, but proved costly later, and that restraint made all the difference over a lifetime. As these lessons accumulated, it became clear that financial rules do not stop at money. They extend naturally into career choices, commitments, and how life itself is structured. I watched people make decisions that looked attractive in the short term but quietly limited their future. A career chosen solely for income, a commitment accepted without considering flexibility, a responsibility taken on before the foundation was strong enough to support it. None of these choices looked disastrous at the time. In fact, they often looked sensible. The consequences only appeared years later, when options had narrowed and reversibility was gone. One quiet rule was the value of optionality. Keeping options open does not feel productive in the moment. It can look like indecision or lack of ambition, but optionality is a form of insurance against uncertainty. People who preserved it could adapt when circumstances changed. People who traded it away for immediate rewards found themselves locked into paths that no longer suited them. Knowledge could explain why change was needed. Discipline would have prevented the trap from forming in the first place. I saw this clearly in careers. People often optimize for prestige or short-term compensation without considering long-term satisfaction or resilience. When industries shifted or personal priorities changed, they discovered how difficult it was to pivot. Skills were too narrow, obligations were too heavy, time was no longer abundant. Avoiding big mistakes here meant choosing paths that allowed for learning, adjustment, and recovery rather than maximum early reward. Commitments followed the same pattern. People said yes too quickly to partnerships, projects, and responsibilities without considering how hard it would be to say no later. Every commitment consumed time, energy, and flexibility. Over time, the accumulation left little room for reflection or change. Pressure increased, and under pressure, judgment deteriorated. The quiet rule was to be slow to commit and quick to preserve freedom, even when opportunities looked appealing. Reputation also fit this framework. I watched people compromise principles for convenience, assuming they could repair the damage later. They underestimated how long memories last and how little tolerance there is for repeated lapses. Just as with money, reputation compounds slowly and is destroyed quickly. Avoiding big mistakes here required restraint in moments when cutting corners felt harmless. Those who protected their integrity rarely needed to repair it. What connected all of this was respect for irreversibility. Some decisions permanently alter the landscape. Once made, they cannot be undone without significant cost. Avoiding big mistakes meant recognizing which choices fell into that category and treating them with appropriate caution. Not every opportunity deserved a response. Not every path needed to be explored. Looking back, the people who lived well financially and personally were not those who maximized every option. They were those who avoided closing doors unnecessarily. They valued flexibility over excitement and durability over appearance. That mindset did not eliminate risk, but it ensured that mistakes remained survivable. The quiet rule was simple but demanding. Protect your future self from decisions that feel reasonable today but restrictive tomorrow. Doing so rarely attracts praise. It often looks cautious. But over a lifetime, it preserves the most valuable asset of all, the freedom to adapt when reality refuses to follow your plans. With enough time, the shape of these quiet rules became unmistakable. They did not appear as formulas or clever strategies. They appeared as behavior repeated consistently, often without recognition. People who learned them early were rarely dramatic. They were calm, selective, and unhurried. Their financial lives did not swing wildly because their decisions were designed to withstand uncertainty rather than exploit it. What they built was not impressive in the short term, but it was remarkably durable. One of the clearest patterns was how these people reduced exposure to situations that demanded constant judgment. They did not try to outthink every problem. They structured their lives so that fewer decisions carried severe consequences. Simple rules replaced frequent deliberation. This was not laziness, it was self-awareness. They understood that judgment weakens under stress and designed around that reality instead of denying it. Another pattern was how little attention they paid to appearances. They were comfortable looking conservative, slow, or even outdated. They did not measure progress by external validation. They measured it by resilience and peace of mind. While others chased validation through visible success, these individuals quietly strengthened their position. Over time, the gap between appearance and outcome grew wider, and it favored those who had ignored the noise. I also noticed that people who followed these quiet rules rarely felt rushed. Urgency is a signal that something is fragile. When finances or life require constant acceleration, mistakes become more likely. Calm, by contrast, allowed learning, reflection, and adjustment. Knowledge could finally operate because it was not competing with pressure. The absence of urgency was not accidental. It was the result of choices made years earlier. What surprised many was how these behaviors reinforced each other. Simplicity supported discipline, discipline supported patience. Patience preserved optionality. Optionality reduced fear. Each element strengthened the others. This created a system that protected itself. People who lived this way did not need extraordinary luck or perfect timing. Their system absorbed shocks and continued functioning. Over time, the benefits became obvious. Fewer crises, fewer forced decisions, fewer regrets. When challenges appeared, they were manageable rather than overwhelming. This was not because life treated them more kindly, but because they had built buffers against its unpredictability. The quiet rules did not eliminate difficulty. They transformed it from disaster into inconvenience. Looking back, The most valuable thing these rules produced was not wealth itself, but freedom. Freedom from panic, freedom from constant worry, freedom to say no, freedom to wait. That freedom was earned slowly through restraint that often went unnoticed. It did not come from brilliance. It came from respecting limitations and designing life accordingly. The tragedy is that these rules are learnable early, but rarely taught early. Most people encounter them only after making mistakes that could have been avoided. Those who learn them sooner gain an advantage that compounds quietly for decades, not because they do anything extraordinary, but because they stop doing the ordinary things that cause irreversible harm. By the time these lessons fully settled in, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The most important financial rules were never hidden, but they were rarely emphasized. They did not shout for attention. They did not promise excitement. They simply waited, quietly shaping outcomes while people focused on louder advice. Those who ignored them often believed they were making progress right up until the moment they realized how limited their options had become. What I want you to understand is that learning these rules late is not a moral failure. It is human. The world rewards urgency, confidence, and visible success. It does not reward restraint, patience, or survival until much later, when the results are undeniable. By then, the lesson feels obvious and painful at the same time. People look back and say they always knew better, without realizing that knowing and living by these rules are very different things. These quiet rules are not about deprivation or fear. They are about alignment. They align behavior with reality rather than hope. They accept that uncertainty is permanent, that mistakes are inevitable, and that protection matters more than prediction. Following them does not make life smaller. It makes it more resilient. It allows progress to continue even when conditions are unfavorable. If there is one habit worth cultivating early, it is the habit of asking what you cannot afford to lose, not in theory, but in practice. Which decisions would permanently reduce your freedom? Which commitments would force you into desperation if conditions changed? Which behaviors feel harmless now but irreversible later? These questions rarely feel urgent when things are going well. That is exactly why they matter most then. Over decades, I watched people who learned these rules early live calmer, more flexible lives. They were not immune to setbacks, but setbacks did not define them. They had room to recover, room to wait, and room to think. Those who learned the rules late often spent years repairing damage that never needed to exist. The difference was not intelligence or effort. It was timing and restraint. The quiet financial rules do not promise extraordinary wins. They promise something far more valuable, the ability to keep going. They protect time, flexibility, and peace of mind. They turn life into a process rather than a series of emergencies. And once you truly understand them, you stop searching for loud advice and start paying attention to the small, consistent behaviors that shape everything. If you listen carefully, these rules are still there, operating in the background. They reward patience and punish neglect with equal consistency. Learning them early does not make you feel clever. It makes you feel steady. But over a lifetime, steadiness quietly outperforms almost everything else.